So, hello everyone. This is our last meeting of summer, and today we are welcoming Simon Critchley, distinguished philosopher, and we have been reading your book on humor, and I really wanted to discuss it with you for quite a while. So, thank you so much for joining us, Simon. And I will start by asking some questions that I wanted to ask. And then if we have time, hopefully, I'll invite the rest of you into discussion. So my first question is quite general. What is humor existentially for you? And you mentioned that it expresses something essential about human beings and that it might be a humanity of the human, or the core of being a human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it might be non-human too, I just finished reading a book about birds and about these extraordinary birds called caracaras that are mainly in South America, but in different parts of the world. And they seem to have a lot of fun. Maybe they laugh too. So it might not just be humans, it might be non-humans too. But certainly, one way of picking out what it means to be human is in terms of humor. And then, and obviously I talk about that in the book. And the book is not a book on comedy, it's a book on humor, because it's a phenomenon that can be more easily located, I found. It began as a concern with comedy a long, long time ago, but that just became too fluffy and general. I wanted something historically specific, and I think humor is that. So yeah, humor is human. We laugh, and laughing at ourselves, we look at ourselves from outside ourselves. We find ourselves ridiculous, and that's great. That's basically the argument of the book in a nutshell.
That's actually great that you mentioned that it's not human, because it was one of the problem with the book. It's generally the problem with any philosophical perspective, that it's anthropocentric. And just mentioning birds, for example, we might extending it is one of the possible ways. Like it's everything that is laughable and eccentric, the way you call it. That not only humans might be eccentric, but they are part of nature, and nature might be also seen as expression of humor in its own way. And
Right. It could be eccentric as well. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot about animals in it. I mean, there's a whole chapter on human animal relations. So, and the way animals show up in jokes. Yeah, that's chapter 2. So I really have, and I think it's I'm very, very eager to point out that it's, the fact that we can laugh at ourselves in no way makes us in any way better than dogs and cats or whatever. In fact, probably makes us worse. And the way animals figure in different types of humor is something I try to analyze in the book. I'm just looking at it now, a long time since I wrote it. And, you know, yeah, Horatian and Juvenalian satire and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and human beings as yahoos in trees shitting on the ground, and then the rational animals are horses and all of that. So all of those, humor is the place where all of those inversions of the human animal coupling take place. So yeah, so I don't think that there's anything particularly special about being a human being.
and another perspective on, and you write about it, that there is some connection between what is humor and what is philosophy, that the humor might be seen as the philosophical activity because it's abstract relation to the world, its type of thinking. And you also mention phenomenology as bracketing of belief that happens in humor too, not only in philosophy. So do you still think there is a connection
Oh
that
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would take back to the point I didn't answer about eccentricity. I mean, the idea of that what makes human beings, one of the characteristics that we have is eccentricity with regard to ourselves, that we are, but we do not have ourselves. I think that's the epigraph to chapter 3, which I don't actually, I was just looking at it this morning. I don't cite it, but I think that's from Helmut Plessner. I lifted that idea. Yeah, ich bin, aber ich habe mich nicht. I am, but I do not have myself. So the idea of that there's a fundamental disconnection in being ours between the fact of this or you, whatever that might be, and the way in which I experience myself in what we, sometimes call self-consciousness or reflection. That gap within ourselves is kind of that's our basic eccentricity, and that's to be noted, celebrated even. And then philosophy is kind of the philosophy is the kind of area of human existence that explores that, and often the best way of engaging in philosophy is through a series of jokes. There's been some very good if you think about, for example, Descartes' Meditations, which begins as a series of, it's almost like a stand-up routine. Imagine that all these people aren't human beings, they're robots. How would I know this, that, and the other? It's a kind of comic routine. And once you defamiliarize ourselves from ourselves and what we take for granted, then you can really open things up. And the other, I mean, I am a phenomenologist. I'm an existential phenomenologist, and I came out of the closet about 4 years ago. I love saying that I'm an existential phenomenologist because there aren't many of us left. And so I think that the phenomenology is about the attempt to describe our pre-theoretical immersion in the world, in life, and but that's very hard to get a view on because we're just stuck inside it for most of the time. And the fascinating thing about humor is that how would I put this? Humor is kind of practically enacted philosophy, so that the kind of thing that we ask people to do in philosophy, to look at themselves outside themselves, to adopt a standpoint of reflection and question their basic presuppositions, is something that we also do in a very day-to-day way in humor and jokes. And so therefore, to that extent, insofar as people have a sense of humor and that's shared, then they're all philosophers too. And that's pretty good.
Yeah, great response. And also genuine question, if there is a coincidence of philosophy and especially phenomenology, existential phenomenology and humor, why philosophy is not funny, fun? For me, it is. It also depends,
It is. For
also
me, it's,
depends of, for
yeah.
one, what kind of humor. If your humor is maybe weird enough or sophisticated enough, it's just fun. But the very maybe fact that it's not funny is fun when someone calls themselves philosopher and they pretend to be smart and they're actually not. Like we philosophers are not, but they are. So this very seriousness of philosophy for me is the most comic part.
Yeah, seriousness of the people, philosophers that appear to be serious are very often stupid. And I'd say that more generally about people too. It's a kind of ponderous, humorless, pious, attitude to things where all humor is drained out of existence. So I find, I mean, the philosophers that many philosophers that I've encountered over the years, people that taught me, were incredibly funny and bizarre characters who I learned a great deal from, and they and that wit had a kind of freedom to it that enabled you to push more deeply into questions of great importance. But so for me, much of what I love in philosophy is much of what I love in humor, and the two things really overlap. And some of the greatest philosophers are also the funniest philosophers. Someone like, I don't know, Sidney Morgenbesser at Columbia, who wrote nothing, but he was a very funny person. And he's known now just for his jokes, you know. So I think for me, it's really important, you know, and there is a kind of ponderousness, a kind of fake seriousness that people have in regard to philosophy, that it feels somehow intimidating, overwhelming. The task of the pedagogical task, it seems to me, if you're in the business of teaching this stuff, as I am, is to use humor to kind of deflate that seriousness, that ponderousness, and thereby bring people in. That's always been my aim.
You also claim that one has to share a certain common sense.
Yeah.
To share, so for joke for the possibility of a joke. But in this regard, maybe philosophy is different, and I'm hoping that it's not so, because as for me, I was born in Soviet Union, Soviet Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine, and which means that within the environment I'm currently in Ireland, I'm not able to make a joke, but nonetheless, maybe there is still something, the other level of humor or the other type of humor, hopefully, that is more universal than just more the people who share common sense. Maybe philosophy is also a certain kind of language. And for example, like maybe there is more transcending kind of humor in a way that people share even outside of common sense, or some kind of like something against the common sense within the common sense.
Yeah. I mean, the chapter is that's chapter 6 on humor as sensus communis, which is common sense, but it's also sociability. Really, it's the idea of sociability. And you know, I would, in this part of the book is really looking at the history of humor, because the thing about humor, unlike comedy, and unlike, well, the thing about humor is that you can kind of date the moment when humor becomes something funny, because humor obviously relates to the idea of the humors and Galen's medicine, and it goes back to the ancient Greeks. But humor is something funny, you know, raillery of looking outside oneself and finding oneself ridiculous, poking fun at things, is something that really originates in the English language in the late 17th century. And you can kind of locate it there, as I try and do. And the first theory of humor in that sense is Earl Shaftesbury in around 1709. And then and so there you've got a specific history, a context, and then a series of weirdnesses that I talk at some point in the book about. There's a section called an Englishman, a Frenchman, and an Irishman, I think, where I talk about the article on humor in the encyclopedia in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie. It's actually in chapter 5, where you get the great French encyclopedist writing an essay on humor, saying that humor is something specific to the esprit anglais, the English spirit. And there's, as an example of that, he goes into a discussion of Jonathan Swift, who of course was hardly English. He was Irish. And then I begin to explore the tangled Siamese twin-like relationships between Englishness and Irishness in relation to humor, right? So that's a really interesting topic. Now, with humor, you can say, well, everybody laughs, or humor is universal, or whatever. And I think that's true, but empty and vacuous. It's like saying that everybody goes to the toilet or everybody breathes. So fine, but where do you go to the toilet and what kind of air do you breathe? So humor takes on life in a context. And the Soviet context was a particularly acute form of humor because people were operating in different types of code, where you had a formal language or let's say official language, state language, which was and so people learned to engage in a kind of a double speak or to flip over what was acceptable in terms of what could then be ridiculed. So totalitarianism is very good for satire. Actually, it's a very healthy satirical context. Like my favorite old Czechoslovak joke from the 1970s, I think it's why do Czechoslovak secret policemen go around in groups of three? You need one who can read, one who can write, and one to keep an eye on the two dangerous intellectuals. So there you've got, so humor is a way, in that sense, is a way of survival in different, but it is contextual and it is different. And people laugh at different things in different places, and that's fine. But everybody laughs. Okay. But to give it some thickness, some porosity, you need to think about a context and then how that context, blends with other contexts. So, for example, the Anglo-Irish tradition is a particularly kind of rich one because the way in which Irishness has been articulated for the last few hundred years is by, poking fun at the ponderous, stupid seriousness of the English, and vice versa.
By the way, you seem to be when we talk about humor, that's you related to English humor, and in Russian language, and that's what I thought, English humor, Русский, английский humor means the absence of humor. It's not funny, completely opposite.
Yeah, and that's where I end up. I mean, the book ends with, I'm against laughter. That's my astonishing conclusion in the book, is that because there's a philosophical valorization of laughter, and you can find this in the way in which, I don't know, a good Russian example, the way someone like Bakhtin was picked up in the West. Bakhtin's book on Rabelais and his world, and the idea that there is this Rabelaisian laughing, lower bodily stratum that erupts in laughter. And then you've got, all of those dreadful Nietzsche scholars over the last two centuries who've been talking about the laughter and the laughter of the mountaintops and all of that. I think that's really worrying, that kind of laughter. That's the laughter of someone that really needs medical attention. And whereas humor actually isn't funny in that sense, it doesn't necessarily lead to laughter. And so I end up in the book with Beckett, who's kind of one of the heroes of the book, probably the hero of the book. And for Beckett, it's about smiling, a toothless smile for preference. And the smile as the way in which we find ourselves ridiculous. So in that sense, that if humor is what makes us smile, it doesn't make us laugh, and it isn't even really funny, because it's what we're laughing at is our basic wretchedness. And the book ends with, this is something I like to do in books, is to hide things. The last line is, "Our wretchedness is our greatness," which is from Pascal. And so in a sense, humor allows us to focus on the character of human wretchedness, which is not funny at all, but it can open that up. And to focus on that is to find something. There is a nobility in that.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah. It's also, let's first leave aside distinction on smiling and laughter. But stay with humor that you discussing, maybe in a form of laughter, in a form of smiling, but what kind of function humor has in society, performs in society, and do you think it has revolutionary power? Because you mentioned two types of jokes. One is reactionary, the one that changes nothing, it just reinforces existing order, and the other type of jokes that change the situation. We might call them revolutionary. Those the second. Do you still think that it might be revolutionary in a way?
No, because I'm a passionate anti-revolutionary and always have been.
I was hoping you answered the opposite, but for me,
Oh
that
no,
you would
no,
say that it's revolutionary, and I would tell you that there is something funny about revolution as such. The very word revolution, the way it functions, because the word means going forward, going backward, and what we imply is going forward. So this self-mockery revolution that mocks itself, maybe that's the only type of revolution that I would accept. There is this human in revolution itself. We always want changes for the better, but it always ends up, no matter what we do, it always ends up the way it's for the worse, the way it always ends up.
yeah, I mean, you'll notice in the book there isn't a chapter on politics. It was kind of on my mind, but it's just I just couldn't figure out what I thought. But certainly not revolutionary. I think revolution is obviously revolution begins as a description of the movement of the planets around, and that's the best place for it in my view, as a description of an astronomical movement. And I think books that I'm oh gosh, I mean, don't get me started, but I mean, worst books in the world, Hannah Arendt's on revolution, terrible. And so I've always been deeply suspicious of revolution. I come out of a tradition, if you like, a kind of English socialist tradition, which is deeply skeptical of revolution for reasons that you can find detailed in George Orwell and Arthur Koestler and various other people. And that really goes back to debates around the French Revolution and what we make of that. But basically, if you have a revolution, you upend the institutions of a society and you create a power vacuum, and there's a brief moment of joy, which is usually followed by murder, and then the figure of the tyrant or the dictator comes onto the scene. So I think I think we can change the situation in which we find ourselves, but that doesn't imply revolution. And the quotation that you gave, you alluded to, it's a great quote. It's from a piece, a play. It was actually written for television in the 1970s by Trevor Griffiths called Comedians. And he's teaching, this happens a lot, but didn't used to happen at this time. He's teaching a group of people how to be a comedian. And he says, this is on page 9 of the book. A real comedian, that's a daring man. He dares to see what his listeners shy away from, fears to express. And what he sees is sort of truth about people, about their situation, about what hurts or terrifies them, about what's hard, above all, about what they want. A joke releases the tension, says the unsayable, any joke pretty well. But a true joke, a comedian's joke, has to do more than release tension. It has to liberate the will and the desire. It has to change the situation. So most people think of jokes as just sort of tension releases, so you get the one-line gag or the kind of bad stand-up that dominates comedy at this point. And that's, anybody can do that. You just pay a comedy writer, you get some jokes written, you can get some laughs. But a true joke has to take that laughter, and what that opens up is a kind of space in us, a reflective space into which you can then, as it were, you can then push. You find this, for example, in great comics like, I don't know, like Lenny Bruce, who would use comic techniques to kind of open up the audience and then hit them with something really hard. So the good thing socially about comedy is that when people are laughing, they're kind of open, they're soft, they're kind of they've agreed to go along with this sort of tacit contract with the comedian and to engage in this banter. And once you've got them like that, then um, you can really hit them with some awkward, painful truths about who they are, and that's pretty important, I think.
Yeah, but also,
But the
isn't
last
it?
thing sorry, the last thing is that revolutionary jokes often have or the what the funny thing about jokes is that uh, a progressive or a conservative joke could have exactly the same form, exactly the same structure, but the content changes. So and the form of the joke actually interests me a lot, and whether so in a sense most political jokes are usually of the releasing tension, kind of simple, kind of you know quips and takedowns, and that's not what a real comedian does. A real comedian uses that material to open something up, which is much more searching, truthful, and painful.
But even if it's not the joke that does not support the existing order, does not simply deflate, but the one that aims to produce a change, or the one that seems to be dangerous for the existing order, it can also probably have a power of just power of being neutralizing, something, the liberation or revolutionary potential, not liberation, but potential of changes that, you
Which is
know,
what that's always the case. I mean, jokes can be, you can, which is the problem with the traditions of satire that we have, which are beautiful and fascinating, but in many ways, the strongest traditions of satire are reactionary. You poke fun at whatever's happening now. You pick something, that's funny about what's trendy now, but what's behind that is something actually conservative and reactionary. So um, I think satire often often conservative, even when it's completely liberal. It can be conservative. The way people used to in say 2016 laugh at Trump, and that didn't work, did it? It wasn't really taken seriously. And I think we've now reached a point with satire where, in a sense, reality has kind of outstripped satire because reality is so oddly totally satirical that it's hard to know where you would insert something that would uh, be able to take down a position. So I think a lot of comedians have struggled to find their targets in the last 10 years because reality has already kind of internalized that satire within itself. If that makes any sense.
yeah, and it's probably to to make fun of something, you're supposed to know what is the serious part of it, and if the serious part of it kind of disappears, the
Mm-hmm.
reality laughs at itself, and it's the horror. And we will proceed. I will have questions about the tragedy of both, the coincidence in a way of tragedy and a comedy. But for now, you're not mentioning revolution, but you're mentioning something even worse, the messianic power or religion than evolution. And you claim that humor has the messianic power, but claiming that unlike religion, who promises transcendence, this mega transcendence into a better world that overcomes the limitations of human existence, um, the transcendence of humor, one might say, is more moderate. Like it brings one back into the this world and shows that there is no other world. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something similar to Freud distinction between this neurotic misery and ordinary unhappiness. It just gives the moderate transcendence, the maximum we can have, the laughing at reality, not laughing, but smiling at reality and ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the messianism here is a very, I mean, people 20 years ago, 30 years ago used to get very excited about Walter Benjamin. They used to get very excited about Walter Benjamin, and they're very excited about Walter Benjamin's idea of weak messianic power in the thesis on the philosophy of history, the last text that he wrote before he topped himself on the French-Spanish border. And the point that other people have made, like Jakob Taubes, is that messianic power has always been weak. There's not strong messianic power. There is just weak messianic power. So messianic power, which is the power of the Messiah, Christ, say, is really weak, so weak that he gets crucified. That's pretty weak. So the Messiah is the weakest of the weak. And then jokes can open that up. You can see something, a joke well told and well handled can enable you to see the situation that you're in from a slightly different angle. And that can be a weak messianic power. You see the everyday as such in a slightly transformed way. This is suggested in different philosophers, but often not done in a very humorous way. Someone like Adorno, who's, for Adorno, what we cannot occupy is the standpoint of redemption, and yet that's the position that we have to occupy, and he does that in his paratactical logic of his later work. But you can see that happening in jokes. In jokes, you can be just torn apart from where you are, and you see it in a different light. That's what I mean by messianic power. And Freud, Freud is also kind of the hero of the book, but not the usual Freud. Of a Freud that I invented, I suppose, because people, I don't think, give enough attention to this tiny little essay that Freud wrote in 1927 called Humour. And psychoanalysts, let me tell you, are a hard audience to speak to. Let me give you an example. I'll tell you a funny story. So I did, when I was doing this stuff, a long time ago, back in the 1920s when I was writing this book, I did 2 talks back to back. And one was to the English faculty at Cambridge. And it was, and I got big laughs. Really big laughs. They loved it. And I felt really good about the material. I thought this went really well. My points really landed. And then I had to talk to a group of psychoanalysts that was a Sunday, and did the same material, got nothing. It was like the moon. It was just dead. And then afterwards I was just very depressed. And I went, this was in central London. I went to a pub just opposite the British Museum to drown my sorrows. And in that pub, so psychoanalysts are a very hard audience. They're a particularly humorless group in my experience, because they're so tightly bound with their status anxiety and legitimation and qualifications and who went what where and who is whose disciple and all of that crap, in my view. But going back to this awful evening, I was then in this pub having a couple of beers in the museum tavern, and this old guy came in, and he was at the talk, and he said something like, "Yeah, that didn't go very well, did it? That was they're a bad audience, yeah." And they said, "By the way, you were talking about Beckett. I was a friend of Wilfred Bion." "Oh, really? You're a friend of Wilfred Bion?" Yeah, I knew Wilfred Bion quite well. He was my training analyst a long time ago." "Oh," and Bion had been Beckett's analyst in 1935. So Beckett had almost 2 years of psychoanalysis in the mid 1930s. Psychoanalysis at that point was illegal in Ireland, which is funny, right? Illegal in Ireland. So Beckett went for psychoanalysis because he was so depressed, to London. And that's where he wrote Murphy, one of his early books, which is very funny and very dark. And Bion, and the psychoanalysis was paid for by Beckett's mother, which itself is really interesting. And Beckett's got lots in his work about the real problem in his life was his mother's savage loving. His mother's savage loving. Anyway, so at the end of these 2 years, Beckett stopped analysis. I forget where he went next. But Bion said to this guy that I was talking to in the pub, Bion said to him, I could do nothing with the boy, Beckett, because he was just too happy. Which is a fascinating remark, because you read Beckett's work, you wouldn't have thought that Beckett was the happiest person in the world. But Bion, who was a pretty skilled analyst, let's say, said no, he was just too happy. I couldn't work with him. You think about that in relation to Beckett's work, it does cast an interesting light, right? That we think of Beckett as dark and somber and miserable, but actually it's very close to what is great in the best comedy, in my view. And it's obviously completely informed by his love of silent movies and Laurel and Hardy and Buster Keaton and all the great early comics. Anyway, so Beckett is kind of interesting. Oh, Freud. Oh, yeah. Do you want me to talk about Freud?
That's what I was actually wanted to ask you about the connection of depression, comedy, humor, and depression and melancholy. And that's when you bring Freud. And you beautifully write that at the heart of humor, there is a black sun of depression. You never develop it, the beauty of it, but then you proceed, I think, mentioning Freud, this idea that splitting of ego, it produces melancholia and mania, but also humor, dark humor. And so this link between, very strange link of coincidence in a way, or how they replaceable humor, melancholy, and depression. That's very interesting. When you mention Freud 1927 essay Humor, where he discusses that the idea of how humor can be in a way relief. And on one hand, this kind of melancholic perspective, it also gives one self-knowledge. It might be adequate how horrible one is, but in narcissistic way. But the other option is dark humor that has the same structure as depression. There is something similar between them, but it also antidepressant. And you mentioned that it's even better than in this way as the Prozac, for example, or antidepressant, because they work in through deadening ego. And this one is actually laughable acknowledgement of how one is pathetic. So this, what interests me is coincidence, how they're not opposites, the depression, and at the same time they're not opposite, but at the same time they are opposites. But
that's very, very well put. That's a better summary than I could do at this point. So thank you for that. So humor is an antidepressant that has the same structure as depression. That's kind of my thought. And you have to kind of really struggle to find interesting psychoanalytic work on humor, because the way it works is, you've got jokes. I think Freud's joke book is great, mainly because he left it alone, unlike the interpretation of dreams, which he just kept fiddling with, and which makes it hard to read. But the joke book is kind of very simple analytical structure, and jokes are linked to the unconscious, blah, blah, blah. But then, he comes back to the theme of the comic in this late essay on humor. And humor is what, and the example is, again, this is what makes Freud so great as a writer. He'll just begin with an empirical example. He won't do some theological theorizing, based on a series of abstractions. I won't mention who I've got in mind there, but it's, you begin with an example. The example is of a man that's condemned to death. And on the morning of his execution, he's taken out to the gallows to be hanged. And he looks up at the sky and says, well, the week's beginning nicely. Na die Woche fängt gut an. And that's the joke. And he's hanged. So the humor there, Freud says, is that he can look outside himself and find himself ridiculous. And in that there is something. What words does he use now? Yeah, liberating and elevating. Befreiend und erhebend, I think he says in German. Something like liberating and elevating. And that really got me thinking. So maybe the one original thought in the book, particularly with regard to psychoanalysis, is that thought that the humor reveals a different relationship to what we think of as the superego, right? So normally we think of the superego as bad, or what our Slovenian friends used to call, the obscenity of the superego. It's obscene, it's telling you no, 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 and all of that. And so we have to, and there's a lot of that in Lacan as well. The idea that the superego has to be pushed away in order for the unconscious to rise up. It's a nice story, but the superego also has another function. There can be so this is what, in a brilliant piece of theoretical innovation, this is what I call superego 1 and superego 2. Superego 1 is the superego that is punitive, that's telling you you're a piece of dirt, and you shouldn't do things, and you're the punitive superego. But there can also be a superego that's revealed in humor, that can be a self-awareness, perhaps even a comfort of a type. And I think that's interesting to me, and I think it could be developed, but I'm not a psychoanalyst, so it's not really my line of work. But I think there is another aspect to the superego. So you see that the point isn't the superego is bad. There can be different forms of the superego. There can be a superego that can, as it were, tell you very, very wise things, and can remind you of your pathetic character, your ridiculousness, and that can lead to perhaps a humility and a modesty about how you go about your life, which I think is on the whole a good thing.
Thank you, Simon. I have one last question. Sorry, guys. We're also reading the paper on comedy and finitude, replacing the tragic heroic paradigm in philosophy and psychoanalysis. And the amazing thought that you have there is that you try to replace, let's say, not comic, but maybe humor. You claim that in philosophy, in German philosophy, there was more the prevailing tragic heroic paradigm, but especially in Schopenhauer, Heidegger, with exception of Kierkegaard, and later Lacan is the one who proceeds with this tragic paradigm. And you prefer comic anti-heroic paradigm, or we can say humorous humor. And you claim that tragedy is not tragic enough, and only comedy is tragic. So how would you explain this?
Right. Yeah. Well, that paper on on tragedy and comedy, what's it called, displacing the tragic heroic paradigm, that was written in about 97, and I thought I was onto something with it, and I was very much at that point trying to figure out what was going on with Lacan's reading of Antigone in Seminar 7, and other related texts like Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics and things like that. And I stumbled upon this contrast between the tragic heroic and the comic anti-heroic. And then as I was developing that line of thought, I came to the view that comedy was just too loose a category to contain what I wanted to think about. So then I shifted from there into a discussion of humor, and that then led to the humor book. I mean, humor has got a narrower focus, and as I said before, a kind of specific linguistic and cultural history, and I could tell some of that history. So it felt, whereas comedy is like it's like juggling with spaghetti. It's really hard to get things straight. So that's why I moved into the question of humor, because I could find a target for the thought I wanted to develop. But the stuff about tragedy and comedy, then that takes another turn in work I've done. About in 2019, I published a book on Greek tragedy called Tragedy, the Greeks and Us, where I try to use tragedy against philosophy. And that's another story we could go into. But by that point, I come to the view that the best tragedy, the most interesting tragedies, which for my money are the tragedies of Euripides, are ones where the line between the tragic and the comic is continually shuttling back and forth, and you really struggle to identify, a Euripides play as a tragedy or as a farce. It's and that's very interesting. And then we tend to see all that through the lens of Aristotle and his ponderous, boring taxonomy of tragedy in the Poetics, and then we kind of back project that onto the plays and miss the phenomenon. So I think what's already happening in tragedy is that tragedy itself is being is completely intersected by comedy and the ridiculous and satire, and that's one of the reasons why it's still so powerful. And that's true of the Greeks, and it's also true, obviously, of Shakespeare and many others. Where do you draw the line between tragedy and comedy in Shakespeare? Often the most tragic plays are the most ridiculous and comical, like Hamlet.
Thank you, Simon. We have a question from Levon in chat, and she's asking if what are your thoughts on the Joker regarding using humor as survival?
Let me look at the chat. The Joker. You mean the Joker in Batman or the Joker in general? The figure of a Joker?
Both. The figure of the Joker in Batman or the Joker in the court. Sure.
Okay. I think Jokers are, it's a strategy of survival. Yeah, precisely. Humor is a survival strategy. And then that depends on your context, right? If you're in the former Soviet Union or the modern day Russia, then that's one thing. If you're somewhere where jokes are permitted, then that's another thing. But jokes are always forms of survival, and they're kind of ways of breathing, finding a space of respiration in lives which are dominated by a kind of pious fake seriousness, in my view.
Thank you.
The Joker in Batman, he sort of takes it to a whole new level, though, where he starts to take the lives of other people. So I'm kind of thinking more in that regard of, you know, it's one thing to have a good laugh at ourselves, and it's another thing to hurt other people. So that was
Sure.
kind of where I was going with that question. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, there has to be some kind of, I mean, there's always been an interesting, not interesting, there's always been a blurred line between, comedy and violence. And that's something which, we have to continually pay attention to, because, where I'm sitting now in the United States, you can see how comedy and ridicule and poking fun can lead to forms of political violence. Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I think the best way of thinking about one of my favorite comedians is someone called Stuart Lee, and Stuart Lee is a genius in my view, a philosopher of the first order, and he talks about stand-up routine as being, when you're on stage, there are a massive pair of quotation marks around the stage. So you're speaking with this huge pair of quotation marks. And you have to understand that. You do understand that a joke is being told, right? An act is being performed. And I think the key thing, one key thing is having, and this is under threat. It's the stand-up routine as a form, right? A form that can last an hour and a half, surrounded by these huge quotation marks, where you go through a whole series of experiences, and where things which can be offensive are said, and then unsaid or said in different ways, and you're pulled this way and that, by an expert comedian that understands the form and lives with that form, and that's a beautiful thing. I think the form of a full length stand-up comedy routine by a great comedian. But we live in a kind of an age of the triumph of the literal, and where quotation marks seem to be harder and harder for people to kind of insert around speech, and that's a pity, because there has to be, in order for comedy to work and for humor to work, there has to be a zone of freedom which is mutual, which is shared, and where the joke teller or joke tellers and the audience are in a kind of a contract. There is a relationship of trust between them, and that gives a certain liberty to speech, and that's really important, it seems to me.
So the differentiation I'm kind of getting at is more the disposition behind humor being to harm or to survive and get over. So when you talk about psychoanalysis, and at the heart of I could do nothing with the boy because he was too happy, part of psychoanalysis is actually radically accepting and being able to laugh at yourself. But then there's this humor that's violent, where you actually do want to do harm, right? And there's a differentiation there between those two.
Yeah, I'd say that was just bad comedy, terrible humor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so humor that wants to use humor to incite violence is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the act, it seems to me. But that exists, and it's deeply unpleasant. Yeah.
We might have time for one more question.
Okay.
No.
Well, thank you for reading the book.
Thank you for writing.
Well, it's a long time ago. Also, with this book, it's I like to hide things in writing. It goes back to something you were saying before about the sort of fake seriousness of people that of certain types of approaches to philosophy or the intellectual life. And one thing I developed with this book, and which I've carried on since, is that the surface of the book is quite smooth. You can read it knowing very little, and that's great. But underneath the surface, there are these little submarines and floating crafts and explosive devices or whatever. And so I developed a sort of technique of sort of trying to kind of keep the philosophical infrastructure kind of under the surface in order to allow a different reading. A kind of form of subterfuge in a way.
Yeah, great form. Are you planning to write anything on humor or comedy, or probably not comedy in the future? Because this is the book that deserved to be written again,
Oh, I mean, I try to change. I always, another thing I try to do with my work is to do something and then do something else, so that and to go off, which is not what you're meant to do as an academic. As an academic, you're meant to find that one little thing you keep on doing that till you die. But I think you try and find a phenomenon, which is a shared phenomenon which everybody can understand, like humor, and then develop that into a form that is at least entertaining and interesting, and then go off somewhere else. And so the next book I've got coming out is on mysticism, which is in a way not unrelated to humor, but is a very different. I've tried to keep shifting and moving on. I don't intend to write anything on humor. I might write something on. I did think about. No, I remain fascinated with humor. I watch a lot of comedy, and in comedy I still live in hope. I still believe when I'm watching a new stand-up comedian or a new show, I'm still hopeful that it's going to be good. Usually it's shit, but sometimes it's good. And that's a really important thing for me.
Yeah, on
one hand, hopeful is a tough word in this group, Simon. But the negative psychoanalysis group, but the comedy of the mystical anarchism, could be good, emancipatory, maybe even. So
yeah,
thank you.
They weren't a very funny bunch, the mystical anarchists, the heresy, the free spirit. But yeah, it can be, and it could be. But it's. But yeah, you find the writing books is finding the form, and you find the form, and then you move on to the next form. That seems to be what you have to do. Otherwise, you just end up saying the same thing, writing the same book over and over again. And there's plenty of people that do that. I've been trying not to do that. It just takes longer, and you've got to keep, learning new things. But that's good.
On one hand, this book should never exist, because that's not what you do with humor, right? You don't write on humor, but he really liked reading it.
Right. The last thing you need is a philosopher writing about humor. Exactly. That's interesting. So that premise is a premise I've used in. The last thing you need is a philosopher talking about poetry. So I wrote a book about poetry. The last thing you need is a philosopher talking about football. So I wrote a book about football. So I've always had this love-hate relationship with philosophy, and often my approach to philosophical topics is deeply anti-philosophical. I just happen to have spent my career in philosophy departments, who are largely who I despise. but I just happened to, that's just where I ended up. It could have it could have gone differently, but that's where I ended up, and it's fine. Happy to teach philosophy. It still interests me enormously, but the humorlessness and the as it were the pseudo seriousness of much professional philosophy never ceases to exasperate me. But I still think there is enough. There are enough people out there that have got genuine interests in these things, and they want something that hopefully speaks to them a bit more. So yeah, that didn't really make any sense, did it? But you can kind of get the idea.
Thank you, Simon.
The essence of finding ourselves ridiculous, that's the key thing. Smile and find ourselves ridiculous, and that kind of to try and maintain that, I don't know, that kind of humility is important to me in relationship to intellectual work.
Thank you I promise that we won't keep you for too long. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon, for writing the book on misusing humor today and your book. Hope to. All right, everyone. Thanks.
Reading it, and good to see you all.
Good to see you all. Bye.
Thank you, Julie.